Okay, let's start.
Хорошо, слышно. Я извиняюсь за то, что я буду говорить по-английски, но, может быть, всем понятно все-таки. Это доклад мой основан на книге, которая только что вышла на английском языке, и чтобы все это перевести сразу на русский, просто не хватило времени и сил. Так что... The title of my talk is Triple Identities, Russian-Speaking Jews as German, American and Israeli Writers. Over the past decade, an increasing number of Russian Jewish emigrants have become successful writers in the languages of their host countries, and by using German, English or Hebrew as their medium of literary expression, these authors have acquired not the binary diaspora identity that we usually look at with Jews, but a triple transnational identity, combining a Russian linguistic and cultural origin, a Jewish ethnicity, in most cases without a religious allegiance, and a German, Austrian, American, Canadian, or Israeli nationality. While these writers have received a warm or even enthusiastic response from readers and critics in their countries of residence and elsewhere, the reception of their books in their country of birth has been indifferent at best or hostile at worst. Very few of their books have been translated into Russian so far, and the reaction of Russian critics has been somewhat reserved. To some extent, this reaction may have been triggered by the fact that writing in a language other than one's native tongue involves a radical act of assimilation to the culture of the host society. For those who follow Herder in romanticizing language as the ultimate carrier of a national essence and soul, for a feature of the native tongue entails a serious loss of national identity. But of course we should keep in mind that as Jews, these writers never really qualified as russkие in their country of birth anyway. Yet one could also argue that paradoxically, by writing in a language other than their native Russian, they made something of a commodity of their Russianness. In what follows, I will explore these issues by looking at a few leading contemporary translingual Russian Jewish writers active in Germany, Austria, the US, and Israel. I will start with the situation in Germany, which is today home to about 200,000 so-called Jewish Kontingentflüchtlinge. The most famous among them is Vladimir Kaminer, who is currently one of Germany's most popular writers. Born in Moscow in 1967, Kaminer had no knowledge of German before he immigrated at age 23 to Berlin. His first book, Russendisco, published in 2000, became a surprise hit and turned the author into the new shooting star of German literature. And Kaminer has since published 16 more books in rapid succession, so you can do the math. It's pretty much a new book every 9 months. For many Germans, Kaminer has come to represent the quintessential Russian, a role that he has learned to play to perfection in a performance tinged with self-irony. In fact, I flew here on Lufthansa, and when I opened the onboard magazine, to my surprise, who was staring at me? Vladimir Kaminer. So, the fact that it says, was steckt in Ihrer Tasche, Vladimir Kaminer? What's in your bag, Vladimir? So it's not about his writings, but what he carries in his bag. Which just shows if the German national airline features you in its onboard magazine, you have arrived as a writer. As the title of his first book indicates, the topic of his Russian identity looms large in Kaminer's literary self-fashioning. Russianness is signaled in a conspicuous, if hackneyed manner, by graphic elements such as Matryoshka dolls or the Soviet star. By contrast, Kaminer's Jewish background appears in a much more muted form. While he's not exactly hiding his Jewishness, Kaminer prefers not to dwell on it either. Nevertheless, an important and largely unmentioned factor, I think, contributes to his popularity with the German public. He is a Jew who has happily embraced the German language and culture and is thus helping to burnish the image of the new Germany as a philo-Semitic rather than an anti-Semitic nation. Given the large number of Russian-speaking immigrants in Germany and the success of Kaminer's Russian brand, the pool of potential new Kaminers is vast. One of Kaminer's competitors is Lena Gorelik, born in 1981 in Leningrad. She emigrated in 1992 with her parents to Germany, and since 2004 she has published 4 books, all of which have been very favorably received in the German press. The autobiographical heroine of Gorelik's novels is a young Russian Jewish woman who came to Germany at age 11 and leads a happily integrated life together with her extended family. Although Gorelik more openly acknowledges her Jewish heritage than Kaminer, she also relies on her Russianness as a tool of self-identification and self-promotion. Both Kaminer and Gorelik present themselves as culturally assimilated, secular, non-threatening immigrants who entertain the German public with humorous, tongue-in-cheek stories about their culture of origin. The double performance as a typical Russian and a typical German is a key ingredient of their strategy, since it allows them to assume a perspective that is both foreign and domestic at the same time. We see this, for example, in Gorelik's book Verliebt in St. Petersburg, In Love with St. Petersburg, where she presents her city of birth to a visiting German friend. The heroine's triple Russian, Jewish, German identity has been reduced here to a Russian-German binary. The word Jew is not ever mentioned in the book. Interestingly, in her latest book, Gorelik performs the opposite operation by focusing squarely on her Jewish identity. Lieber Mischa, which came out last summer, is written in the form of a letter to her newborn son, and it basically makes fun of Jewish cliches, ranging from the Jewish nose to the Jewish mother to the Jewish world conspiracy. The book's jacket blurb states, quote, that Lena Gorelik belongs to a new generation of Jews in Germany who wants to define itself via the future, not via the past. The conundrum of being a Jewish writer in post-Holocaust Germany is of little concern to Kaminer and Gorelik. Anti-Semitism, if mentioned at all in their stories, is presented as a Russian than a German, rather a Russian than a German problem. And this certainly has facilitated their status as model German Jews. Gorelik does address the topic of German-Jewish relations, as we have seen, but anti-Semitism plays almost no role in her fiction. Among the few people who treat her Russian Jewish immigrant characters with condescension are, interestingly, the German Jews. In her novel Hochzeit in Jerusalem, she describes an event at the Jewish Community Center where the Russian newcomers are snubbed at socially undesirable elements. By contrast, the family is moved to tears by a German ceremony of public contrition commemorating the anniversary of the Reichskristallnacht. The implication seems to be that the secular society of a modern and tolerant Germany provides a more accommodating home for Russian Jews than a narrow-minded Jewish religious community does. Now, this, what we could call philo-Germanism, is certainly not shared by all Russian Jewish immigrants, to be sure. Vladimir Wertlieb presents a different example of a Russian Jew who has become a successful writer in German. Born in Leningrad in 1966, Wertlieb settled in Austria at age 15 after a 10-year odyssey through multiple countries, including Israel and the United States. Wertlieb's literary persona is that of the alienated outsider rather than the happily integrated immigrant. Unlike Lena Gorelik's protagonist, who displays her patriotism by rooting for the German football team at the World Championship, the German Jewish hero of Wertlieb's novel Letzter Wunsch has a more complex attitude. When simple souls subject him to an inane loyalty test by asking him which side he will support in a hypothetical football match between Germany and Israel, he varies his answer according to the questioner. To a German, he invariably says Israel, but if the questioner is a foreigner, especially a Jew, then he says Germany. Becoming a writer in German, a language to which he only gradually developed a more positive attitude, finally freed Wertlieb from the need to further emigration, as he explained. Nevertheless, Austria has not become an unproblematic home for him. Wertlieb is well aware of the baggage that he carries as a Jewish author writing in Germany, especially in a country that has been reluctant to confront its own Nazi past. He suggests that the conspicuous philo-Semitism of the Germans today masks an underlying unease. The fisty protagonist of the novel Das besondere Gedächtnis der Rosa Masur, who is modeled on Wertlieb's own grandmother, observes that, quote, as we know, the Germans nowadays love the Jews, at least as long as the Jews don't behave as Jewishly as they believe Jews are capable of but should rather not. The hallmark of Wertlieb's own identity remains an uneasy sense of being in between. His autobiographical novel Zwischenstationen ends with the narrator's arrival in Salzburg, his new permanent home in provincial Austria. The first thing he does after leaving the train station is to purchase a Tyrolean hat and to break into a cheerful yodel. His multinational odyssey thus ends on a faux note of Austrian folklore. Overall, however, Wertlieb's attitude towards his own identity, in spite of an acerbic humor, is far removed from Kaminer's postmodern play with clichés. Instead of assuming the role of the stereotypical Russian, he prefers to keep his distance from any embrace of multicultural tokenism. Gary Steingart, whose novel The Russian Debutante's Handbook, published in 2002, initiated the genre of contemporary Russian Jewish immigrant fiction in the United States, is an obvious figure for comparison with these writers. Steingart was born in Leningrad in 1972 and emigrated with his parents to New York at age 7. His novel was hailed by reviewers as the work of as a new Nabokov and soon became a national and international bestseller with translations into many languages, including Russian. And at the same time, Steingart emerged as a sort of iconic Russian-American personality. In some respects, Steingart's self-ironic performance of his ethnic identity resembles that of Kaminer. Unlike Kaminer's integrated foreigner and ironic model immigrant, however, Steingart, like Wertli, cultivates the persona of a culturally alienated outsider. While Kaminer tends to downplay his Jewish background, Steingart foregrounds his Jewishness as an additional alienating factor. In spite of his irony, he also displays something like a residual ethnic pride. In an interview, he declared that he is proud to be a secular Jew, even though he does not see himself as a flag waver in any way. And in an interview with Radio Svoboda, which was conducted in Russian, Steingart claimed that it was his conscious intention to introduce the Russian element into the genre of American immigrant literature. I quote, «Я смотрел на другие этнические группы, и почти у каждой было по 3-4 романа. Китайцы, индийцы, доминиканцы. А у русских ничего не было тогда. И меня все время смущало тогда. Ведь русская литература на первом месте в мире. Почему это так? Наше поколение молодое не пишет ничего». This comment made in 2005 has become outdated very, very fast. Like Kaminer in German, Steingart has become a trailblazer for a whole generation of Soviet-born immigrant writers in North America, including such authors as David Bizmorskis, Lara Wapniar, Ellen Littman, Anya Ulinich, Olga Grushin, Sana Krasikov, Irina Rein, и так далее, и так далее. There's a long list. In recent years, these authors have come to form a vibrant subgroup of contemporary American fiction, and they have made Russianness a sought-after brand on the US publishing market. As Masha Gessen observed in an article that came out in Snob in 2009, I quote, «Можно быть русским, можно писать об этом, можно быть редактором или агентом русского американского писателя. Точнее так, американскому писателю сегодня лучше всего быть русским». Now, in comparing the Russian-German immigrant writers with their Russian-American counterparts, we notice that both groups employ similar strategies to turn their Russianness into a marketable commodity for their local target audiences. They all deploy cliches associated with Russian culture, both as a marker of ethnic distinction and in some cases as a self-ironic means of auto-exoticism. For example, the picture on the flap jacket of Steingart's novel shows the author in an unstylish fur coat and woolen hat holding a bear cub on a leash. The Matryoshka doll, as a symbol of Russianness, graces the covers of the books of various Russian Jewish authors across the globe, including the Canadian David Bizmorskis, the Germans Kaminer and Garielik, and the Israeli Boris Zeidman. Nevertheless, there are some important differences between the Russian-German and Russian-American writers, which have to do with the different nature of their respective host societies. In the United States, the immigrant experience lies at the core of the nation's self-image and cultural mythology, allowing the Russian newcomers to insert themselves in a long tradition of immigrant and Jewish writing in America. As an intriguing new ethnic brand, it has been claimed Russianness can help revitalize Jewish American literature and assure Jews their rightful place in the multicultural canon. I'm coming here back to something Hans-Ulrich Gumbrecht said this morning, namely American Jews are a little bit too successful for their own good to be included in the multicultural canon because they can't make the status they're an oppressed minority anymore. And there actually the point has been made by the critic Andrei Fuhrman in an article entitled The Russification of Jewish American Fiction, that these writers are, I quote, blessed with the good fortune of immigrant oppression, poverty, and nightmares. And therefore, finally, we have Jews that can be, considered as a bona fide diaspora author again. It strikes me as a highly questionable argument, but nevertheless. Now, the situation in Germany is very different because it's a country that traditionally has defined itself in terms of an ethnically homogeneous German folk. and that only recently and reluctantly has come to grapple with the fact that it has turned into a destination for immigrants. Kaminer's depiction of German society as a vibrant multicultural mix counters the stereotypes of Germans as a homogeneous mass of Teutonic boors or Nazi thugs. His performance of the cool but ultimately harmless Russian and Lena Gorelik's persona of the female immigrant overachiever fits neatly into the utopian projection of the new Germany as a happy multicultural community. Let me now turn to Israel, the country that has received by far the most Russian Jewish immigrants, over 1 million. A comparatively small number of these Israeli Russians have become writers in Hebrew. Of course, there's a substantial literature in Russian coming out of Israel, but many of the Russian Israelis, or most of them, write in Russian, not in Hebrew. And those who write in Hebrew have chosen not to dwell on their Russian status, perhaps out of a desire to gain acceptance as regular Israelis. The only exception to this rule so far seems to be Boris Zeitman, whose novels explicitly address the protagonist's dual identity as a Russian Israeli. Zeitman was born in 1963 in Kishinev and emigrated to Israel together with his parents when he was 13 years old. Like most of the third-wave immigrants arriving in the 1970s in Israel, the family made an effort to shed its Russian identity as quickly as possible and to assimilate to the Israeli mainstream. Trained in visual communication, Zeitman worked as an art director and manager of an advertising agency before publishing his first novel with the title Hemingway and the Dead Bird Rain. The book became one of the finalists for the prestigious Sapir Prize in 2008 and has since been translated into several languages, although not into English or Russian. The hero of the book, Tal Shani, like the author himself, came to Israel at age 13 and now in his 30s lives the life of a normal Israeli. He's suddenly confronted with his past, however, when he receives an invitation from the Jewish agency to participate in a festival of Israeli culture in his Ukrainian city of birth. During the plane ride from Tel Aviv to the fictitious Ukrainian town of Dniestrograd, he begins to reminisce about his childhood in the Soviet Union. The journey becomes a trip backward in time as Shani mentally relives his former existence when he was still known as Tolik Schneiderman. Zeitman's narrative posits a certain symmetry between the life of a Jew in the Soviet Union and that of a Russian in Israel. In both cases, the particular ethnic identity confers an outsider status. As Zeitman represents both the Soviet Union and Israel with irony and sarcasm, depending on the reviewer's own attitude and ideology, Hemingway and the Dead Bird Rain has been interpreted as either a denunciation of Soviet totalitarianism and anti-Semitism, and therefore sort of indirect praise for Israel as a refugee for persecuted Jews, or inversely, as the expression of a deep disillusionment with Israeli reality, resulting in nostalgic feelings for Russia. Both interpretations seem equally one-sided to me. In reality, Zeitman's book evokes the doubleness typical of any immigrant existence. The novelty of his approach in an Israeli context consists of questioning the assimilationist or absorptionist myth of the Israeli melting pot by showing the traumatic consequences of an abrupt, forced change of identity. While there are, of course, important and significant differences between the individual Russian Jews who became authors in other languages, a few pertinent generalizations can nevertheless be made. How much time do I have?
About 8 minutes.
Oh, okay, I'm fine. Even though they all have multiple layered identities, most of them foreground their Russianness in their writings. Paradoxically, as Jews, they managed to become fully recognized as Russians only outside of Russia. This situation creates the uninviable predicament of the eternally denigrated other, the alienated migrant who is a stranger both at home and abroad. The dirty Jew in Russia becomes a dirty Russian in Israel, America, or Germany. On the other hand, an outsider status involving multiple identities can, of course, become a precious resource for a creative writer, especially in an environment that validates multiculturalism or hybridity in whatever guise. It is important to stress that this Russian identity does not automatically emerge as a result of a writer's ancestry, language, or country of birth. Rather, it is actively created in the process of literary self-invention. Possibly as a compensation for the loss of Russianness implied in the shift to another language, the characters and the setting of their fiction tends to be Russian immigrant communities, the former Soviet Union, or contemporary post-Soviet Russia. As far as their Jewishness is concerned, we can really find a wide variety of approaches. While almost none of these writers is an observant Jew, their attitudes towards Judaism range from Wertlieb's earnest grappling with the Judaic tradition to indifference, by far the most common stance, to Gorelik's sympathetic irony, or even to overt hostility, which is the case for Gary Steingart, who has called Judaism a codified system of anxieties devised to keep an already nervous and maligned people in check. The decision to emigrate was prompted in most cases by the promise of economic advancement or the fear of anti-Semitism, more so than by the desire to practice the Jewish religion. The patronizing American Jew who expects gratitude for having rescued his brethren from Soviet captivity and is trying to impose a Jewish religious identity on the Russian newcomers appears as a figure of satirical derision in several of the books by the Russian-American writers. Rather than their Jewishness, then, it is really their Russianness that has made these writers stand out. This is how their publishers have promoted them, and this is the identity of choice that many of them have foregrounded in their own fictional self-representation. One banal reason for this decision may simply be that Russianness sells better than Jewishness in the current fiction market. And again, maybe to go back to what something has been said this morning, this aura of the diaspora seems to not that work anymore for Jews, and so but Russians still that confers you this sort of outsider status that you can capitalize on. So Gary Steingart called this book the Russian Debutante's Handbook. A title like the Jewish Debutante's Handbook would not have worked in that respect at all. It would have conjured up this sort of upper middle class Jewish picture. Or a title like Judendisco would have been possibly bizarre, right? He only could call it Russendisco. And for a Russian-Israeli writer like Boris Zeidman, Russianness is in fact the only distinguishing ethnic identity he can claim, because being a Jew doesn't make anybody stand out in Israel. In Russia, to be sure, the literature produced by these emigres has met with quite a different response. The lack of enthusiasm for these authors in their country of birth demonstrates to what extent the success of ethnic literature depends on the conditions of the local target culture. The Russian features in the identity of these writers, while providing a source of exotic appeal to the Western target audience, may be precisely those elements that strike a Russian reader as phony or cliched. Paradoxically, these authors then had to become foreigners in order to invent and market themselves as Russians. But if they want to be taken seriously by their former compatriots, maybe they will have to shed their Russian identity altogether. And several of these writers have indeed indicated plans to move away from Russian or immigrant subjects in their coming works. Just last week, I was at the Festival of Recent Russian-American Writing that was held at Tufts University in Boston, where I was one of the panel moderators. And Gary Steingart actually announced that he has had it with the Russian theme, and he wants to be his next novel just to be about a normal American. But then he also has said he had no idea what this is going to be about, and he was actually asking for suggestions. And I think what that shows is it's not that easy to get out of this immigrant routine once you are stuck in it. And Kaminer is a clear example of somebody who I think has become stuck in a certain routine. And he calls himself der Russe vom Dienst, like the Russian from central casting. And that's sort of the role that he has learned to play to perfection, and I think will play to the end of his days. So, the future will see whether this wave of Russian-American or Russian-German literature is going to continue or is it going to ebb away and disappear. But given the lucrative market for Russianness, I think it's doubtful that Steingart, Kaminer, and potentially others will stop playing the Russian card anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian, and we will start our discussion. Please give your names. It's important for our reporters because we will print the score of our theses and the discussion in the magazine, New Literary Observer. So we need to know the names and just to be acquainted better to each other. Пожалуйста, когда будете задавать вопросы, представляйтесь. Это важно для тех, кто будет писать потом отчет о наших банных чтениях и публиковать его в журнале. Ну и чтобы как-то ближе познакомиться всем, узнать в лицо. Пожалуйста, вопросы.
So do I have to say that I'm Sepp Gumbrecht? So, okay. I mean, this was very, very interesting in terms of the question, what is the historicity of diaspora cultures? And I have two questions/proposals. The first one would be that what you're describing seems to be a relatively coherent genre or discourse. I mean, across the different cases. There are, of course, different cases. The configuration is always different. But I would actually tentatively say probably you don't necessarily need the Jewish component. I mean, you have components of multicultural existences, so to speak. And this aura of tragedy, repression, and thereby necessary obligatory appreciation is no longer there. So that seems to be, I mean, I will not say opposed, but that seems to be a new situation. That is the first. Now, the question would be whether, and one of the authors you were quoting is interesting in that sense, says, well, I've had it with that type of discourse. So whether this is a transitional situation, where the fascination of those multicultural existences is still existing, but as they are becoming increasingly the normal case, that they may be less interesting in the future. So we are no longer in the situation where this is a repression, where some liberation or melancholia accompanies them, but it is decreasingly interesting, and so maybe it's a transitional stage. That would be the first suggestion. And the second one is about, if we call that literature, what type of literature is it? It is certainly not meant to be quote-unquote great literature. I mean, it doesn't have the ambition of 19th century novelists. No, I'm not making a value statement myself. I'm trying to talk about what the ambition is. It is autobiographical, but it doesn't have an autobiographical arc, I have the impression. It's not writing your autobiography and the final version. I mean, it's not in the tradition of Rousseau's Confession to really find out what your life was all about. They are, so to speak, snapshots, fragments, and it's an ongoing discourse, so to speak. And you can continue, you cannot continue. You can be very prolific. I mean, you can write one book like that every 9 months. You can go slower. You can do it as a parallel job, and so forth and so forth. So, I mean, it's a situation after something. It might be transitional. That would be one suggestion. The second one about this status. I mean, you know, it reminds me to a certain degree the way you describe them to writing blogs. Yeah, you write from time to time, and at some point when you have 200 pages, and the publisher, you publish that blog. That's what I'm doing.
Well, yeah, several things. I mean, yeah, I think the Jewish component is not needed. In fact, some of those Russian immigrant authors are not Jews and still write in this mode. So that's one thing. And of course, is it a transitional phenomenon? I mean, the context we put it in is immigrant literature, and you know there have been all these ways. There is like the early 20th century genre of immigrant literature in America, which is like the classic model, and they're sort of hearkening back to that, but also subverting it by saying we are not. It's not the narrative of assimilation; it's the narrative of counter assimilation and sort of the diasporic. We keep our our identity as foreigners. The question is, of course, how realistic is that? Because isn't to some extent assimilation unavoidable, and certainly with the next generation? And that's a question I actually asked at this panel in Boston. And David Pismorskis is the one who sort of acknowledged that, yes, of course, I'm less and less Russian. I'm more and more American. So at the end of my life, I'm going to be more American and not Russian at all. But nevertheless, I will keep continuing writing about Russian themes because that's what interests me as a phenomenon, and that's, And in a way, it's the disappearance of the immigrant situation doesn't mean that the theme will necessarily go away. Maybe it will become mythologized. Just like, for example, the Western emerged as a genre when the real, Wild West was disappearing. So is that what you're witnessing? The birth of a new, cliche that will be perpetuated almost ad libitum, even though if the real immigrant situation disappears, that would be one way of arguing that it will continue. But I did notice, I mean, there is a certain unease about, certainly also Lara Vapnyar, another one of those authors, said, you know, I hate immigrant literature and I'm fed up with it, even though that's what she writes. But there is a desire to transcend this phase of being an immigrant. But at the same time, of course, you can capitalize on it. So how do you handle that? Oh, there's a huge... I mean, they're bestsellers, basically. I mean, Steingart is hugely successful. And he's also, as I said, he has been translated into Russian, like his first two novels. And I'm not sure he did that well here in Russia, but maybe some people can... The reviews I've looked at, I haven't read all the Russian reviews, they were sort of lukewarm. But what's interesting, you know, some Russian reviewers called him a typiczny Amerikaniec. And that was not meant as a compliment, right?
Kevin?
So thanks for a really stimulating paper. I mean, there's a comparison case. First of all, I was wanting to think about specific kinds of cultural packaging for specific marketability purposes, and that's the situation described by, for instance, Jim English in his study of the sort of international market in book prize literature, in which you have to produce a sort of a faux authenticity representative of your place of origin, yet not too representative of your place of origin, or else it won't be recognizable in terms of international circuits. And here we have a sort of a minor version of that, right? So you don't write as the, you know, kind of internationally niceified, you know, the Salman Rushdie of Russia or the Salman Rushdie of, you know, wherever, Sierra Leone. You have to write as the Russian of New Jersey in order to achieve recognition within a specifically American, generally, book market. But that limits you. You're not going to get an international prize for writing like that, and certainly not getting a prize in Russia for writing like that. So that was one sort of train of thought that I was sort of thrust upon, the specific possibilities of diasporic literature for self-packaging in terms of kinds of marketable experiences and marketable identities, and the limits and possibilities of that in terms of book markets. But the other possibility I was thinking about was literature which is not marketable. And I'm thinking about, for instance, Keith Gesson, who's a great case of a really, you know, tremendously good American author who doesn't market at all his Russianness and hasn't done that well either in terms of selling books in the United States, attempting to make great literature, but is much more recognizably within a Russian tradition than any of these Steingarts, too. If you look at his writing, it seems much more like a Russian novel than anything else. It's also a great American novel in certain ways, too. But
you mean all the literary young men, like his novel which has not been marketed as a Russian product at all, which, even though Keith Gesson is no less Russian than Steingart or any of the other ones.
He's much more Russian. Yeah. He spends a lot of time here and, you know, talks with his sister a lot. So it's sort of peculiar paradoxes of the situation. It's like the other sort of comparison case, though, was poetry, in which you never make any money anyhow. And I wanted to ask you if you've paid attention to the American poetry scene, because I sort of pay attention to it out of the corner of an eye because I know these people, but I haven't thought about the specific productions of identities. Is there any kind of an analogy in terms of American poets marketing themselves as Russian? Because like people like Eugenia Stashevsky does not. He is Russian in the same way that Keith Gesson is Russian, and you can identify Russiannesses in his writing. On the other hand, he's trying to be an American poet.
Yeah, I mean, in his English, you know, written in English, I don't think he sort of sells himself as, you know, as somebody who sort of writes English with a Russian accent, so to speak. I mean, he doesn't play, and then, you know, he writes in Russian and he's a Russian. Yeah, I think poetry is a very different genre, of course. And if you talk about marketing your identity to sort of a mass audience, I think you have to exclude poetry right away, because that's just not for a mass audience. Yeah, you're not going to sell, you know, poetry. Exactly. So you have to write, you know, as a novelist, and then you can sort of. But I think Steingart, I mean, the quote I read to you in Russian, I think that's very revealing. So he almost did like a market analysis, right? He looked at the situation and said, okay, we have Chinese American novels, we have Chinese Indian novels. We don't have an American Russian novel. Okay, I'm going to write it, right? And he did.
The follow-up question of that, though, is that, I mean, Asian American writing is perceived to be a part of like canonical, serious American literature, right? So you have English departments appointing, you know, chairs in, you know, Asian American studies and so on and so forth. Is that even possible to imagine? I can't see like a chair in Steingart studies. So what is the difference between, you know, Amy Tan and Steingart? Because, you know, Tan similar niche, but this is a very different beast, I have a sense.
Well, if you look at the academic reception, actually the first people in the American academia who became to take notice of these authors were Jewish studies people. They were all very excited because, there is this theory that Jewish literature is fading because, Jews are too assimilated. And here we have these new Jews coming, new immigrants who write. And also, I should mention, all these writers got prizes for Jewish fiction from Jewish organizations. But it's in some ways, it's a little bit of a misreading to sell them as Jewish authors. And actually, Anja Ulinic told me that she was a finalist for the Sami Rohr Prize, which is a $100,000 prize that you get from some Jewish organization. But they interviewed her, and they want, do you send your child, to Hebrew school? And she said, no, why should I? Or, in what ways is your fiction good for the Jews? And she had no answer to that, and then she didn't get the prize. So that's the Jewish studies angle. And then there is the Slavists have sort of started to jump on the band. Well, I guess I'm a Slavist, so I have to confess, I just wrote a book about them. But just a few years ago at the AAAS conference, I think in Boston, there were no fewer than 4 panels devoted to this phenomenon. So it has sort of beginning to take off. I know there are people like writing dissertations about this. And, the people, well, there's also, within the field of American literature studies, those who are interested in ethnic literatures, they're beginning to pay attention to that too. There's going to be a special issue of Melos coming out this summer. Actually, it's a special issue on the future of Jewish American literature, but they commissioned me to write a piece there, especially on these authors. And basically, my contribution was to put a big question mark whether this is really Jewish literature in any kind of, so they didn't particularly like that, but that's what it's going to be.
Hasib Ahmed?
Yeah.
Sorry, and we will have a room for one more question. So, after Hasib.
I just have a brief question, and it piggybacks a bit on the first part of the question, by the previous question, which was, I recently heard Robert Pippin, the Hegel scholar, speak in Chicago, and he was talking about a piece that he had written for the New York Times, which was in defense of naive reading. And what he was sort of arguing was that, that the artist or the author should produce without the kind of intentionality or the kind of academic ideas of its interpretations. So they should produce complexity or contradictions from the materiality of the writing itself. And I wonder if this is, and he kind of argues that the problem in art today and writing today is not really a problem of the inability to produce good art, but really it's the problem of reception. So I wonder about this kind of eagerness on the part of writers, but also on the part of academics to interpret the work at the level of its success as a Jewish novel or Russian novel, or to reduce it in that way. And so if you're going to not kind of pin it to its just biodata, in a sense, what would you say today are the idiosyncrasies that make up Russian literature? Not in terms of where it's coming from or the biography of the author, but like what is it that would make a Russian literature tradition today in general?
Yeah, among these authors that there are obvious biographical parallels. They were all born in the Soviet Union and then came. So that's this experience alone sort of shapes your worldview to some extent. But then I think they're very different from each other. But one thing I actually discovered at this meeting in Boston is that they mutually can't stand each other, which is kind of, even though they're publicly they're this sort of united front and they come together to conference. But then when you talk to them in private, they say, well, of course Steingart, he's just like a Bashliak, right, and he's not good. So they all and they're pretty uncomfortable actually with this labeling that's going on, not only with the Jewish labeling, also with the Russian labeling. I think the way Steingart plays it, he plays it both ways, right? He sort of sells himself as a Russian, but at the same time he makes fun of this commodification of an ethnic identity. So he can sort of, in a postmodern base, he can cover all the bases. He's read by people who want to read about the Russian soul or whatever, but he also can be read by people who want to make fun of the Russian soul and read about somebody who ironizes all that. So it works both ways. And I think the same is true for Kaminer.
И последний вопрос. Кто-то хотел задать. I would like to comment just briefly on your last suggestion about this kind of sailing strategy. I think that the construction of Russian identity for the third wave immigrants from the former Soviet Union could be also seen as a kind of universal model displacing the previous one, because what they still could attach to is this universal project of the international Soviet kind of man, right? Which is paradoxically now disintegrated. I mean, this universal project. And while, for example, it's funny and out of date to construct a Jewish identity, right? Russian is still okay. Don't you see this nuance historically and politically?
Well, I think both identities are constructed, obviously, as all identities are. But there's sort of an ascendancy of certain identities that become more fashionable. And it seems to be, at least in America, sort of Jewish identity, that's not really what confines you any particular cachet in these days. And Russian identity still does. And that's, but, you know, are they really Russians? You know, who knows? You know, in some ways they are, of course. But you define it yourself, what your Russian identity is.
Okay. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you.
И следующий докладчик Александр Белобрысов.